What must Juneteenth be? Juneteenth must cause us all, not just black folk, all Americans of moral consciousness, to say we will remember, but when we will remember, it will make us refuse to relax or to retreat when it comes to justice. Because we don't have physical slavery today, but we still got slavery. Too much of this country is enslaved to lies. They're enslaved to meanness. They're enslaved to homophobia. They're enslaved to racism. They're enslaved to xenophobia and the hatred of people that are different. And the truth of the matter is, until there is equality, freedom is not enough. Because none of us is free until all of us is free. So Juneteenth can't be a party. We can't even let governments and cities take over Juneteenth, because they'll mess around and water it down. If you're not going to have the right government and they take over Juneteenth, you won't even know it's about slavery when they get finished with it. Somebody. Give it up for the indomitable Sauda Ashe. And to all my dear friends here in Rocky Mount and Eastern North Carolina, I'm honored to be here with you today on this Juneteenth remembrance here in Rocky Mount. And as I look out on you today, I declare black is beautiful. In fact, humanity is beautiful, and these children are beautiful. You know, it's good to be in a city where you have more than 40 black-owned businesses in downtown Rocky Mount. A city where you are supporting a substantial affordable housing bond, rebuilding inner city with the focus on black businesses. Somebody give it up. Because when you build up black businesses, you literally build up the whole community. A city that is recruiting supply chains and major industries and recruiting to build the future of black and brown legacies in this city and in this county. A city in the South where you have a majority black city council, a black female city manager, black fire and police chiefs, a black assistant city manager, Edgecombe County commissioners, majority black with the black chair, majority black Edgecombe County School Board, a black female superintendent, black Edgecombe Community College president, a black-led federally qualified health care center offering primary care, dentistry, pharmacy, behavioral health, radiology, mammogram, urgent care, exercise, therapy. All that means is this community is beginning to understand that we all have something to offer. And that when you leave out any people, you end up hurting all people. Today on this Juneteenth remembrance, I can't help but remember when Joshua, in the 4th chapter of Joshua, told the priest to go into the water of the Jordan and to get 12 stones and to bring those 12 stones out and stack them on the shoreline. And somebody said, why would you remember this? And he said, you put these stones here that in the future when your children ask, what do these stones mean? Then is here you can tell them that this is where God parted the waters and let the people come through into the promised land. I want for a few minutes to talk about why Juneteenth can't be merely a celebration, but needs to be a form of consecration. Because when we remember, it must be so that we understand. If you remember right, you'll understand why we can't relax and we can't retreat. But before I can talk about Juneteenth and what that day meant and means, I need to say a word about chattel slavery. You know, there are a lot of people that are mad now that history is being truly taught. They call it race critical theory, where we are critical of how history has been told in this country. And all race critical theory is saying is that we're not going to deny the truth. So what was the truth about American chattel slavery? Notice I didn't say slavery, I said American chattel slavery. Because American slavery was one of the few forms of slavery in the world where the slaves were considered less than human. And they were considered to be property. That's what's unique about the American slavery system. It was a form of human bondage where the humans in bondage were seen as being less than human. Where black slaves were violently torn from the motherland of Africa and sold into slavery like livestock. The slave was seen no better than a cow or a pig or a piece of furniture for over 240 years. And in American slavery, it was perpetual. That meant your children were automatically slaves, and their children were automatically slaves. The slaves were, I don't know how many of you know this, but they insured the slaves. Just like you buy insurance for your car or a racehorse or a tractor. If you go to New York City, there's a place up there called Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange. But about 2 blocks from the New York Stock Exchange, they didn't always exchange commodities like gold and silver and businesses. They exchanged men and women and children. Don't you let anybody ever tell you that slavery was just a Southern problem. Slavery was an American original sin. And slavery thrived under colonial rule. The British and the Dutch they used the slaves to build their farms and to build their towns and to build their cities in what would become the United States. Enslaved people were bought to work on the cotton and sugar and tobacco plantation, and the crops they grew were sent to Europe to be turned into finished products and clothes. And then the money that they made from selling the crops were used to fund more trips to go to Africa to steal more slaves. I don't know if anybody's ever told you, but in the 19th century, U.S. banks would sell securities that helped fund the expansion of slave plantations. And to balance the risk of going across the waters and bringing human beings into slavery, the slave traders would have their ships insured and their slave cargo insured. And they would deliberately overpack the slave ship because they knew so many people were going to die. And the sharks followed the slave ships because of the trail of blood of those that would die on the passage over here. But even when they died, the slave traders would get paid because they had insurance on their property. These policies were meant to protect them from the risk of the boat sinking or the slaves dying. And I don't know if you know, but New York Life, that's how it became as strong as you see it. And you see it on the TV today. New York Life was an insurer of slaves. AIG was an insurer of slaves. Aetna was an insurer of slaves. And not only that, many banks in this country owe their entire beginning and existence because the southern plantation owners, they couldn't keep all that money under the mattress. They had to put it in a bank. And recently, J.B. Morgan Chase in 2005 admitted that Citizens Bank and Canal Bank in Louisiana were built off of slave money. They allowed people to come in and offer slaves as collateral for a loan to build a house. And if they defaulted on the loan, then the bank took ownership of the slaves and sold them. Oh, I know somebody may not want me to tell this. Not only that, Citibank, have mercy, Bank of America, were well-known U.S. financial institutions that benefited from the slave trade. And that's why slavery was sustained by violence. It wasn't just a hatred of black people, it was a love of money. And the love of money is the root, as my grandma used to say, of all evil. Slavery was sustained by lynching, by whipping, and by raping, which is one of the reasons some of us have all these different colors in our pigmentation. In 1840 in America, the church split over slavery. That's how you got a Northern Presbyterian and a Southern Presbyterian. That's how you got a Northern Baptist and a Southern Baptist. In fact, the church split over slavery. And before the church in America split, Mexico became an anti-slavery country. And that's what they were doing at the Alamo. They weren't there because they were courageous. The folk that fought the Alamo wanted to keep their slaves. And Texas was a part of Mexico. So don't you go around calling Latino people immigrants. They owned California. They owned Texas and New Mexico. That was their land. And Texas rebelled and fought because they wanted to keep their slaves. You think about it for a second. Here in America, we had to get an order from a president to have what God gave us at birth, freedom. Slavery was rooted in some very cynical things. First, slavery, the philosophy of slavery was first evil economics. In other words, the end justifies the means. No matter how you make the money, long as you make the money. If you got enslaved people, just make the money. That's evil economics. Then the next thing that undergirded slavery was sick sociology. And that is that some people have to be low and other folk have to be high, and they can't ever intermix. The next thing that undergirded slavery was bad biology. And that is that you could determine brain size by skin color. You could determine intelligence by skin color. And then the next thing that undergirded slavery was political pathology. And that is, if you write a constitution or you write a Declaration of Independence, you first got to consider how to write it without challenging the reality of slavery. And then the last one was heretical ontology. All that is a big word for meaning they said God wanted it like this. That God was the author of racism. That God was the author of slavery. And that's why you got to understand that racism is a form of insanity. To be a racist means you crazy. You messed up. You think you bigger than God. And if you submit to what racism says about you, you just as crazy as the racist. Slavery, the goal was free labor. Race was the way to ensure that the systemic racism of slavery was only applied to a certain group of people. That's why Thurgood Marshall said in his closing argument in 1954 before the Supreme Court that the only way the courts could maintain separate but equal would be to declare that the goal of America was to keep the Negro as close to slavery as possible. And because of slavery, there was a war, the Civil War. 620 to 750,000 soldiers died. We don't know how many civilians, and until Vietnam, all over the issue of slavery, more people died in the Civil War than died in all of America's wars put together, World War I, World War II, all the way up to Vietnam. That's what slavery was. And before you can talk about what Juneteenth ought to be, you got to first deal with what slavery was. If you understand what slavery was, Juneteenth can't be a place where you just shake your booty. So then what is Juneteenth? In the middle of the Civil War in 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Can I teach anyhow, Andre? And y'all stop saying he freed the slaves. He only freed the slaves in states that were in rebellion. That's why Delaware kept their slaves. He only freed the slaves that were in the states that were rebelling, and basically said, if you stop rebelling, you can keep your slaves. And every state in rebellion got the memo but Texas. And the states that did get the memo, they only got it when you had enough Union Army people there to make them get the memo. It wasn't until June 19th, 1865, that 250,000 slaves got the message about the Emancipation Proclamation. Now let me correct one more thing. Juneteenth is not when slavery ended in America. I hope y'all don't get mad with me and kick me out of Rocky Mountain. December 6, 1865 is when slavery was considered illegal because that's when the 13th Amendment was ratified by all the states. It was passed in January of 1965, but it wasn't ratified until December 6, 1965. Juneteenth is the day that the slaves finally heard about the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's why I'm not so sure, this is just me, Frank Jones, I'm not so sure that we ought to be calling Juneteenth a celebration. As my faith as a Christian won't let me call it that. I can call it a commemoration. I can call it a convocation. I can call it a time we ought to have a reconsecration. But something about it won't let me call it a celebration. Because our forebrothers and sisters that heard that they had been lied to for 2 years, they weren't happy. In fact, they was mad as hell. And they understood that the slaves actually wanted more than freedom anyway. Oh, let me help somebody. You see, if you can keep people in slavery for 240 years, and then after 240 years you just say, well, y'all can go. No reparations, no 40 acres and a mule, no voting rights. Anybody would take that deal. John Hope Franklin said that if you could keep people for 240 years in slavery and then on the 241st year, you just say, oops. Okay, y'all free. No. Freedom was not what the slaves were after. Freedom was a step toward what they really wanted, and that was dignity, full citizenship, and equality. Now, if that's the case, I'm going somewhere. If that's the case, what could make supporting a Juneteenth holiday a form of cynical hypocrisy? Could America actually end up being a hypocrite by, on the one hand, passing unanimously in the Senate for a Juneteenth holiday, but on the other hand, still be in bondage to racism? So you pass Juneteenth, you vote as a Senate entirely, but then you refuse to pass the For the People Act to stop all this voter suppression. That ain't nothing but cynical hypocrisy. We don't mind the holiday, but you pass the holiday and you still won't restore the Voting Rights Act. That's nothing but cynical hypocrisy. You passed the holiday, but you got 140 million people living in poverty before the pandemic, and 750 people dying a day from poverty, and 250,000 people dying a year from poverty, and 32 million people who make less than a living wage. And you won't pass living wages, and you won't pass unions, and you won't take care of essential workers. That's nothing but cynical hypocrisy. Because you want to act like all the racism is in the past, when the vestiges of racism are still with us today. You won't pass police reform, but you want to come, and y'all be careful. Y'all ain't going to bite me back no more, that's all right. Y'all be careful in the next years to come, because see, these politicians are going to want to start coming to the Juneteenth. And you ought to have somebody over there on the steps to say, did you vote for voting rights? And if you did, you can't come on this stage. Did you vote for living wages? Well, I voted for the holiday. Well, hell, no. Vote to make elections a holiday. Vote for that. I'm too old to play no more, y'all. You got 87 million people uninsured. And you can support a holiday, but you can't support universal single-payer health care. 87 million people uninsured. We're the only country of the 25 wealthiest countries in the whole world that does not make sure that people's insurance is hooked to their body and not their jobs. This is hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy. I don't care if North Carolina has a black lieutenant governor saying there ain't no racism. You got essential workers that died during this pandemic. We gave 86% of the first COVID relief to all the banks and the corporations. We didn't raise the essential workers' pay to a living wage. It was poor folk and low wage folk that saved America during this pandemic. They were the first to work, the first to get infected, the first to get sick, and the first to die. We gave them a name change, essential workers, but we treated them like they are expendable. And the majority of them have been black and brown and women. And when you can do that, but then vote unanimously for a holiday, that's a cynical hypocrisy. 5 million workers that lost their jobs during the pandemic lost their insurance. And not one bill was passed to guarantee insurance. Black workers lost their jobs at twice the rate of whites. Nearly 11% of black Americans have no health insurance. Prior to the Affordable Care Act, 1 in 3 Hispanics and 1 in 5 black people were uninsured. Since the Affordable Care Act, there's still 30 million people that remain uninsured that would be insured by the Affordable Care Act, but all of the southern states like North Carolina have refused to embrace the Affordable Care Act. That's Obamacare if you don't know that name. And half of the 30 million that could be covered are black. If you voted for the holiday, but you haven't voted for health care, that's a cynical form of hypocrisy. Right now in this country, black folk are 6 times more likely to wait an hour to vote, while in white communities it's less than 10 minutes. And you've got states voting on things right now to make it longer. And did you know that when people have to wait an hour in line, it means that for every hour, the next election drops by 1%. So when people have to wait in line for an hour this election, 200,000 people don't vote in the next election. And in North Carolina, did you know right here in North Carolina, the North Carolina Republican Party looked at the data after they passed that racist voter suppression law that we beat them in court, but before we beat them, they said, look, the data is showing that voting in the black community is crumbling. And it was reported by Fox, not Fox, but Vox, V-O-X News, that they were rejoicing. And so to claim to support Juneteenth, but to refuse to address these real issues is a form of hypocrisy. Look at your neighbor and say, I don't have time for hypocrisy on Juneteenth. 48% of North Carolinians are poor and low wealth. 56% of our children. 62% of all black people in North Carolina are poor and low wealth. Don't tell me you support Juneteenth, but you can't support living wage jobs. 1 million people are uninsured. 9,000 people are homeless. In North Carolina, it takes 87 hours of work per week at a minimum wage job just to afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. In North Carolina, there are 2 million workers that make under $15 an hour. In North Carolina, almost 50% of the workers make less than a living wage. Don't tell me you believe in Juneteenth, but you don't vote to change the lives of everyday people. But not only, turn this mic up some, not only is it hypocrisy for the politicians, it would be hypocrisy for us to just turn it into a party. and a day off rather than a day on. I knew I wasn't going to get an amen, but that's all right. What must Juneteenth be? Juneteenth must cause us all, not just black folk, all Americans of moral consciousness, to say, we will remember, but when we will remember, it will make us refuse to relax or to retreat when it comes to justice. Because we don't have physical slavery today, but we still got slavery. Too much of this country is enslaved to lies. Am I right about it? They're enslaved to meanness. They're enslaved to homophobia. They're enslaved to racism. They're enslaved to xenophobia and the hatred of people that are different. And the truth of the matter is, until there is equality, freedom is not enough. Because none of us is free until all of us is free. So Juneteenth can't be a party. We can't even let governments and cities take over Juneteenth because they'll mess around and water it down. If you're not going to have the right government and they take over Juneteenth, you won't even know it's about slavery when they get finished with it. I never will forget when I went to Wilson one time and they had a Martin Luther King breakfast paid for by the city. All the Negroes went out there to eat free breakfast. And the subject of the gathering was, where do we go from here? Now I read the book. They didn't read the book. And when I finished talking about where do we go from here, chaos or community, the city, some of the folk in the city government wrote an article in the paper saying that I shouldn't have talked like that. It should have been nicer. And I said, well, if you don't really want to hear Dr. King, then leave him alone. Same is true with Juneteenth. Say to your neighbor, say, neighbor, it's all right to remember, but we can't relax and we can't retreat. We got to stay at this thing until everybody gets the message and everybody gets the memo. Because 156 years after the first Juneteenth, some people still have not got the message. They think their supremacy is all right. They think their racism is all right. They think their greed is all right. But touch your neighbor and say, they better get the memo, because we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. That's all I want to say. I wish somebody was okay with standing up and say, this Juneteenth must be about, we will remember, but we'll never relax and we'll never retreat from the fight for justice. Juneteenth must say to us, none of us is free until all of us is free. That's right, I feel like preaching some. I'm telling you, Juneteenth got to be a spiritual event. It must be about, we're going to love one another. We're going to lift one another. We're going to help one another. Every time you come to Juneteenth, it ought to revive us. It ought to recharge us. It ought to restore us. It ought to re-engage us. Every time you come to Juneteenth, it ought to embolden us. Come on and help me, man. It ought to engage us. It ought to encourage us. It ought to enliven us. Every time you come to Juneteenth, it ought to push us. It ought to propel us. It ought to prompt us. It ought to prepare us. Every time you come to Juneteenth, it ought to steady us. It ought to strengthen us. It ought to secure us. It ought to solidify us. Tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, we will remember, but we will never relax. We will never retreat. If they didn't give up back then, we can't give up now. Somebody ought to say, this Juneteenth, we put a line in the sand. Ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. Say yeah. Shout remember, but never relax. Remember, but never, ever